Today I'm going to show you how to color grade your S-Log2 footage you shot on your Sony camera. Landscape shot, we are going to color grade it. The main issue with landscape shots is you have a really bright sky with really hot highlights, and then you have a ground layer with really low midtones and shadows, etc., which is a great reason to shoot in log because you can preserve the highlights in the sky. But you run into issues when you start pushing and pulling the footage. Uh, you might clip out your highlights, or you might crush your blacks here, and you won't be able to get the full detail of the sky unless you do a secondary color correction, and I'm going to show you how to do that here. But first we're going to put on a LUT that will convert this footage from your S-Log2 to Rec. 709 color space, your standard video color space. I download this off of the Ground Control website. They have a bunch of free LUTs that you can download if you're willing to give them your email, and they're all free, which is nice. So as you can see, this LUT here is doing a lot of work for us. It's adding contrast, it's adding color, but it's clipping out these highlights, and we're losing a lot of detail in the sky, which I don't like. So we're going to fix that. And another thing to note is I'm putting the LUT in the creative tab here, so when the LUT makes weird adjustments like this, I can go back into the basic correction and make adjustments before the LUT is actually applied, which is really important when you're color grading. You want to get your footage corrected so that it fits into your LUT, so that when the LUT makes the transform on your image, there's nothing destructive happening there. So what we could do, and this is probably more realistic, is we just drop the exposure down here so that we're preserving our highlight detail and we're getting a little bit more color out of the sky, just a little bit more detail and contrast here, and that looks pretty nice. And it's the most realistic, relatively speaking, from the exposure in the sky to the exposure on the ground. But I want to get the most out of both worlds. I want to get a good exposure on the ground, and I want to get a good exposure in the sky, kind of like what you would do in a photo. So we're going to do a secondary color correction, and you do that in the HSL secondary tab here, and we are going to make a selection based on hue, saturation, and luminance. I'm going to focus on luminance, so I'm going to uncheck these, and I'm going to drag out my selection here and grab the brightest parts of the image like that, and I'm going to drag this out until we are selecting everything in the sky, and I'm going to feather this out a little bit. That's pretty good. So we have a pretty decent selection here, and if you check this box, you can see what you're looking at. You can change that to color black, which is nice. Gives you a pretty good idea of what you're looking at. If we zoom in here, we are running into a few issues with some thinner branches in these trees, and that will become apparent when we make corrections. So what we can do to fix that, or ease that a little bit, is we can mess with these denoise and this blur to just kind of make those selections a little less harsh. Okay, so we have a good selection here of our sky. Now we can go into the correction tools below in the HSL tab, and we will just bring the exposure down. Actually, we'll go in here, click on this. We can drop our midtones, and that, when we drop the exposure there, we're actually adding saturation, and that's just something that occurs naturally when you drop the exposure on an image. So that looks pretty nice. I might drop the highlights, not too much, but just a little bit. And that's pretty good. Gives us some good color. You will notice, since we kind of feathered out and blurred our selection, that on the horizon line, you might not be able to see it this zoomed in, but you can kind of see where a little seam where the sky meets the landscape, and it's a little bit blurry. There's kind of a feathering effect going on there, and it's not super apparent, but it might become more apparent once this footage is moving around. So we have that secondary correction on there, and that's all great. So to make adjustments to this layer on the bottom here, I'm going to duplicate the Lumetri color, and I'm going to mute the above tabs here. Since we already put on a LUT, I'm gonna mute the creative tab, mute all these other things. I'm only going to be left with this HSL tab, and we're still making a selection here, which we don't actually want. We're going to refine our selection. So again, we're pulling out the sky, and then we're going to invert this like that. And you can really see here that how we're kind of intermingling with that sky selection there. So we'll pull that down some more, and you can see how when we pull that down, we also lose some of the ground, which we don't want. So we're just going to have to make some compromises here in our selection, which is fine for the purposes of this tutorial. I'm going to reset everything else, so double click on these, set them back to their regular points. I might drop the midtones again, bring those down, might drop the shadows. And if I want to make some more corrections to the sky here, I can just drop this Lumetri color on the very bottom, and that will show, those tools will show up over here. So I think I actually want, I just want a darker exposure on this, just slightly. So go back in here, make a better, stronger selection of the sky. That's good. Uncheck that and flip this. So now we have our ground selection here. Refine that. I'm making this way more complicated than it needs to be, but basically your HSL tab is your best friend when you're trying to make sky adjustments. That's the main point of this tutorial. So you can control the sky exposure independently of your ground, and that looks pretty nice. You're getting a lot of color, a lot of detail out of the sky without even adjusting your saturation. You're just adjusting your exposure. So a couple finishing touches. I might drop a vignette on here, and I've made a preset for vignette. But basically what's going on is I have a Lumetri color, and I have a mask, an oval mask around the image, feathered out and then inverted, so that we're just making corrections on the outer edges of the image here. And then I'm going into the curves tool, and I'm dropping down the midtones like that. And the reason I do that over using this vignette is this vignette affects your highlights, it affects your shadows, it affects the entire image, and it just looks kind of amateurish and kind of obvious. Going in and just dropping down the midtones is a little more subtle, and you're not going to look at it and say, oh, that's a vignette. It's just kind of be an unconscious thing as the image moves that draws your eye to the center of the image, and it just makes it look a little nicer. So if we play through, I mean, you can see what's going on here. It sticks pretty nice, actually. And I'll drop this down just because I'm screen recording at the same time. I'm dropping some frames here. But you can see it looks pretty nice. I'll give you a little bit more resolution here. So yeah, looks pretty good. Got a full resolution. Looks nice. So I'll go ahead and show you a before. That's before. And here's our first layer. Here's our second layer. And here's our third layer. So that's after, before, and after. Once again, we're just dropping a LUT on there. Then we're using our HSL tab to isolate the sky from the ground. And we're making our corrections like so. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. I use this technique a lot. I use it for sky replacements and keying out the sky. I'll just grab a highlight and take everything away using a luma key. So I'll drop a luma key on there, and then, you know, eventually you play around with these knobs and you'll delete the sky or the ground. One of the two. So you can delete the sky using this, and then you can just add in whatever sky you want and motion track it in After Effects and do a total sky replacement. So if you're on a really cloudy day, it's super easy to just drop a new sky in there that looks nice and get the most out of your footage. So yep, that's pretty much it. This is how to color grade S-Log to landscape footage in Premiere.